The plea that shook the courtroom. The morning light streamed through the tall, arched windows of Weston County Courthouse, painting golden streaks across the polished wooden floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls of Courtroom 7B. Judge Everett Daniels, a man whose very presence demanded respect, strode purposefully toward the bench. His black robe billowed slightly as he moved, his lined face a mask of authority. He was a man who had presided over countless cases, some heartbreaking, some infuriating, but nothing could have prepared him for the storm about to unfold. "All rise," came the deep voice of Bailiff Johnson, his presence a towering figure of discipline. The room obeyed instantly, the murmur of conversations ceasing like a switch had been flipped. The sound of feet shuffling and chairs scraping against the floor filled the air as everyone stood, their eyes fixed on the man who now presided over the courtroom. "Be seated," Judge Daniels commanded, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the very air. For the first hour, the courtroom functioned as it always had. Routine hearings passed. Traffic violations, minor disputes, and civil cases that barely caused a ripple in the still waters of justice. But beneath the ordinary hum of legal proceedings, something unsettling simmered just beneath the surface. Judge Daniels felt it. A tension, like a distant storm rolling in, pressing against the very fabric of the courtroom. And then, the case that would change everything was called. Next case, State versus Walter Harrington. Foster care custody hearing for Michaela Robinson. A hushed silence fell over the room. Even the most seasoned lawyers stiffened slightly, exchanging glances of knowing apprehension. This was no ordinary hearing. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open, and in stepped Walter Harrington, a man of power, a man of wealth. He moved like he owned the very air around him, his charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection, his gold cufflinks glinting under the fluorescent lights. With every step he took, confidence radiated from him. Too much confidence, the kind that only a man who had never faced real consequences possessed. At his side, his lawyer, Alan Winthrop, a man whose presence in the courtroom was enough to make opposing attorneys sweat. His reputation was built on winning at all costs, and today would be no different. On the other side of the room, David Fisher, the prosecutor assigned to the case, was already showing signs of strain. A nervous energy clung to him, his palms slick with sweat as he shuffled through his paperwork. His brown department store suit was already wrinkled at the knees, betraying just how out of his league he felt. Then, the doors creaked open one more time, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Michaela Robinson. The tiny girl stepped forward, no more than 8 years old, her presence a stark contrast to the man who claimed to be her foster father. Her faded blue dress hung loosely on her small frame, its hem slightly frayed. Her sneakers, once white, were now gray with age, the laces barely holding together. Her large brown eyes darted around the room, searching for something, someone who might help her. She clutched at the sleeves of her oversized sweater as if trying to shrink into it, to disappear from sight. The whispers started, low, curious, but beneath it, a darker current ran through the courtroom. Judge Daniels observed her carefully, his sharp gaze missing nothing. The way she flinched when her eyes accidentally met Walter Harrington's cold, detached stare. The way her small fingers trembled, gripping the wooden railing of the witness stand as if it were her last lifeline. A chill ran through him. There was something very wrong here. "Miss Robinson," Judge Daniels said, his voice softer than it had been all morning. It was the voice he reserved for his grandchildren, for the young victims who came before his court looking for justice. Michaela lifted her chin ever so slightly, gathering every ounce of courage her tiny frame could hold. "Are you ready to tell me why you're here?" he asked. Her breath hitched. She glanced at Walter Harrington, who smirked, a smirk that made Judge Daniels' blood run cold. Michaela took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper, but when she spoke, it cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Please, Your Honor," She swallowed hard. "Please don't send me back." A gasp rippled through the gallery. A few whispered murmurs spread like wildfire, heads turning, eyes widening. Even the most jaded courtroom reporters shifted in their seats, their pens flying over their notepads. Walter Harrington let out a slow, amused chuckle. "She's always been a little dramatic," he said smoothly, adjusting his silk tie. "Kids say things when they don't get their way." Alan Winthrop leaned forward, adding with a smirk, "Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court that Michaela has a history of behavioral issues. She's been in multiple foster homes. She's been difficult. There's a reason she was placed with Mr. Harrington in the first place." Michaela flinched again, her hands gripping the railing tighter. Judge Daniels narrowed his eyes. He turned to Michaela, his voice gentle but firm. "Why don't you want to go back, Miss Robinson?" She hesitated. Her small chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. A single tear slid down her cheek, but she brushed it away quickly, as if she had learned that crying wouldn't help. Then she whispered, "Because he hurts me." The silence that followed was deafening. A weight pressed down on the room, so thick that even the air felt harder to breathe. The whispers stopped. The reporters' pens froze. Even Walter Harrington's ever-present smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Judge Daniels did not blink. His jaw tightened. His fingers drummed once, twice on the bench. His next words were sharp, dangerous. "Bailiff," he said, his voice like ice, "I want her full foster care records. Now." Bailiff Johnson nodded crisply and turned to leave. Walter Harrington sighed dramatically, leaning back in his chair as if this were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "This is ridiculous," his lawyer scoffed. "This is a child's overactive imagination." Judge Daniels raised his hand, silencing him instantly. His sharp gaze cut through the courtroom. Then he spoke. His next words would shake the room to its very core. "No one is leaving this courtroom until I get the truth." The tension snapped. The gallery erupted into shocked murmurs. Then, the doors locked. The metallic sound of bolts sliding into place echoed through the silent chamber. Walter Harrington's smirk vanished completely. And Michaela, for the first time since stepping into this courtroom, allowed herself to hope. Secrets beneath the surface. The room held its collective breath, the heavy lock on the courtroom doors clicking into place with a finality that sent a ripple of unease through everyone present. Judge Everett Daniels sat taller in his high-backed chair, his sharp eyes scanning the room with the weight of authority pressing down on all who met his gaze. His fingers drummed once, twice against the polished wooden bench, an old habit that only surfaced when he was deep in thought. No one would leave this courtroom until he got the truth. Across the room, Walter Harrington sat motionless, his posture carefully composed, but his eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed something darker underneath. His fingers tightened around the arm of his chair, his expensive gold watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. His lawyer, Alan Winthrop, however, was less composed. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, the veins in his neck bulging with indignation. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he barked, his voice laced with anger and disbelief. "You cannot simply." Judge Daniels raised a single hand. The gesture was small, but its effect was monumental. Winthrop stopped mid-sentence, his lips pressed into a thin, furious line. "I can, and I just did," Judge Daniels said, his voice dangerously calm. "Sit down." Winthrop hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward his client, searching for some sort of confirmation. But Walter's lips barely moved. His fingers resumed their steady drumming on the polished wooden table, a sound that seemed almost too controlled, as if he were keeping time with something only he could hear. Winthrop's jaw clenched, but he lowered himself back into his seat, his movements rigid. Judge Daniels exhaled slowly before turning his gaze back to Michaela Robinson. The tiny girl sat frozen in the witness stand, her small hands gripping the wooden railing like a lifeline, her shoulders hunched forward protectively. And though she stared down at her lap, Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, like a trapped animal cornered with no escape. Daniels felt a tug at something deep inside him. This wasn't just fear. This was terror. "Michaela," he said, his voice softer than before. She flinched slightly, but she looked up. Her wide brown eyes, filled with something haunting, met his. "Can you tell me," he continued, carefully choosing his words, "what you meant when you said Mr. Harrington hurts you?" She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the wooden railing so forcefully that her knuckles turned white. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away this time. Instead, she took a breath, deep, shaky, uneven, and whispered, "He locks me in the basement." The words sent a shockwave through the room. The gallery erupted into frantic whispers. Reporters' pens scratched feverishly across notepads. One woman in the front row pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Even David Fisher, the young and nervous prosecutor, stiffened as his grip on his legal pad tightened. But Walter Harrington, he didn't move. He didn't even blink. His expression remained unreadable, his face carved from stone. Judge Daniels, however, was watching him carefully. He saw the subtle tightening of the muscles in his jaw, the way his fingers stopped drumming for the briefest moment. It was slight, barely noticeable. But Daniels had spent decades reading the faces of guilty men. And this man was guilty of something. "Michaela," Daniels said again, keeping his voice steady, reassuring. "What happens when you're locked in the basement?" She hesitated. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes darted toward Walter, toward the locked doors, and then back to Judge Daniels. Then her tiny voice cracked through the silence. "He says I'm bad." The room grew impossibly still. The sound of a distant siren from the streets outside was the only thing that filled the silence. Judge Daniels' hands tightened into fists, hidden beneath his bench. He'd seen too many cases like this, cases where children were treated like disposable objects, where their cries for help had been buried under money, power, and silence. But not this time. Not this child. Before he could respond, the courtroom doors creaked open again. A court officer strode in, his face grim as he handed over a thick manila folder. "Michaela's foster care records." Daniels took the file, flipping it open. The first few pages seemed normal, too normal. But then his eyes caught something. A pattern. The missing pieces. At first glance, it looked like standard documentation. Placement date, 14 months ago. Assigned foster home, Walter Harrington. Child well-being assessments, no concerns reported. Behavioral notes. Michaela struggles with authority. Daniel's eyes narrowed. This was too clean. No child in the foster system had a completely blank complaint record. Then he flipped further back, and his stomach tightened. Whole sections of reports were missing. Entire paragraphs had been blacked out. A former caseworker's name was simply crossed out, replaced with a vague note, "No longer assigned." Then, buried deep within the file, he found something that made his blood run cold. Another name, Jordan Matthews, a boy, age 9, listed under Walter Harrington's care just over a year ago. The case was marked as closed. The reason? Runaway. Judge Daniels stiffened. Another child. Another missing name. He turned the page, searching for more records on Jordan. But there was nothing. No follow-ups. No investigations. Just a single, final note. No further action needed. Case permanently closed. The weight of realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about Michaela. This was bigger. Something was being hidden. Deliberately. Judge Daniels lifted his gaze, his sharp eyes locking onto Walter Harrington, who was now watching him closely. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Walter's smirk was gone. The courtroom air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. Judge Daniels took a deep breath, then spoke. His next words would shake the foundations of everything that had been buried. Michaela Robinson is not leaving this courtroom until I have every single missing piece of this case. He turned to Bailiff Johnson, his voice carrying the weight of a thunderstorm. I want every file, every foster record, and every missing child report under this man's care. Now. Bailiff Johnson nodded sharply, already moving toward the door. The room exploded into whispers, and Walter Harrington's fingers resumed their slow, steady drumming against the table. Only this time, there was tension behind it, and Judge Daniels knew. The walls were starting to close in on him. The walls close in. The courtroom air had changed. It was no longer the orderly, measured space where the law played out in carefully structured arguments. Now it felt charged, thick with an unseen weight that pressed down on everyone present. Judge Everett Daniels could feel it in his bones. Something had cracked. And the man responsible for that crack sat perfectly still. Walter Harrington. His usual calculated smirk had faded, but not completely. His fingers had resumed their steady, rhythmic tapping against the polished defense table. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, a sound that, to the untrained ear, might have seemed like boredom. But Judge Daniels had seen too many guilty men in too many courtrooms. That tapping, it wasn't boredom. It was a man counting down the seconds until this plan fell into place. Daniels leaned back slightly in his chair, keeping his gaze fixed on Walter, observing every detail. The way his left hand hovered just slightly over his gold watch, the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly when Michaela had spoken. He had something to lose here, and that meant there was something to find. Bailiff Johnson re-entered the courtroom, carrying 3 more thick manila folders. The weight of them alone told Daniels everything he needed to know. Something was very, very wrong with this case. Daniels motioned for the documents to be placed on his bench. He flipped open the first file, his sharp eyes scanning the contents. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. There were other names, other children, other missing case files. Daniels' breath slowed as his finger traced down the list of names, many of which had been marked as runaways. Some had been in the system only a few months before their cases were mysteriously closed. The deeper he went, the more it became clear Michaela wasn't the first. She was just the latest. Judge Daniels looked up, his voice even but filled with an authority that brooked no argument. "Mr. Harrington," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a gavel strike, "what do you know about the disappearances of these children?" Walter didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Instead, he simply let out a small, almost amused exhale. "Disappearances," he repeated smoothly, raising an eyebrow. "Judge, you know how the foster system works. Kids run away all the time." His voice was too calm, too measured. It sent a chill through the courtroom. Daniels' grip on the papers tightened. "These reports say otherwise," the judge countered. "The majority of these children were placed under your care, and then they just vanished. And yet, no investigations." Walter shrugged, his smirk returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know how this city works, Judge. The system is imperfect." He leaned forward slightly, his voice just low enough to make the gallery lean in to listen. "You and I both know that sometimes things slip through the cracks." Daniels saw it then. That flicker of something beneath the surface. It wasn't innocence. It was arrogance. Walter wasn't just avoiding the truth. He was mocking it. Because in his mind, the truth didn't matter. Not when money and power were enough to bend the system in his favor. Daniels took a slow, steady breath, willing his rising anger into something sharper, something more dangerous. He looked toward Bailiff Johnson. "Find the social workers assigned to these cases. I want them here." Walter's tapping stopped. A fraction of a second too fast. A fraction of a second too nervous. Daniels didn't miss it. Tap, tap, and then nothing. The first crack. As the courtroom waited, the air grew heavier. David Fisher, the young prosecutor, was flipping through his own stack of legal papers, his hands trembling slightly. This was too big for him, and he knew it. But something inside him had shifted. Fear had given way to something else. Determination. He stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I'd like to motion for an immediate in-depth investigation into all of Mr. Harrington's foster placements." Winthrop was on his feet in seconds. "Your Honor, this is absolutely outrageous," he snapped, his voice higher than before, a sign of rising panic. "You cannot allow this witch hunt to continue. There is no solid evidence that my client—" Judge Daniels held up a hand. Winthrop stopped talking immediately. Daniels slowly, deliberately reached for the financial records sitting at the edge of his bench. Then, in full view of the court, he turned the file toward Walter Harrington, and his next words sent a shockwave through the room. "Then why do these records show that large sums of money were withdrawn, right before every single child in your care disappeared?" The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the sound of reporters frantically writing. Winthrop froze, his face draining of color. Walter's smile faltered. Just slightly. But just enough. And Daniels saw it. He saw it clear as day. The moment when Walter Harrington realized that this time, he wasn't going to walk away clean. The weight of the evidence was closing in on him, squeezing the air out of the courtroom. Daniels tapped the financial record with a single finger, driving his point home. These payments weren't for child care. They weren't for school. And they weren't for household expenses. His voice dropped, dangerously low. "So where did the money go, Mr. Harrington?" The entire room watched him, waited. And for the first time, Walter's perfect mask cracked. The tapping of his fingers stopped completely. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his smirk gone. A tense beat of silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Walter spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried a warning. "Careful, Judge." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Is that a threat?" Walter's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No." A pause. "It's a reminder." The courtroom held its breath. Walter's eyes gleamed, like a man who knew something no one else did. And Judge Daniels felt it then. Something bigger than this case was hiding just beneath the surface. Something no one in this courtroom was ready for. But Daniels had spent his life uncovering the truth. And he wasn't about to stop now. He leaned forward, meeting Walter's icy gaze head-on. "Bailiff." The room froze. Daniels' voice was sharp, decisive. "Place Mr. Harrington in holding." The room exploded into chaos. And Walter Harrington finally lost his smirk. The unraveling of a monster. The tension in courtroom 7B was suffocating. It clung to the air like thick smoke, the weight of the moment pressing down on every single person present. For the first time since the hearing began, Walter Harrington looked shaken. His usual air of calculated confidence had vanished, replaced by something more primal, something closer to fear. Judge Everett Daniels saw it, felt it. The first crack in the armor of a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable. But the walls were closing in now, and there was nowhere left for him to run. Daniels' voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Bailiff, take Mr. Harrington into holding." The words sent a shockwave through the room. Gasps, whispers, the sound of reporters frantically typing on their phones, their fingers flying over screens as they rushed to break the story. But Walter didn't move. He sat there, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was grinding his teeth to dust. His fingers curled into fists, his gold cufflinks glinting under the courtroom lights. A storm was brewing behind his cold, dark eyes. A storm that Judge Daniels refused to look away from. Bailiff Johnson stepped forward, his posture rigid, his hand resting near his belt, where his cuffs sat ready to be used. "Mr. Harrington," he said firmly, "stand up." Walter let out a slow exhale. Then, finally, he stood. But when he did it slowly, deliberately, with purpose. He straightened his expensive suit, adjusted his silk tie, and turned toward Judge Daniels with a look that sent an unnatural chill through the room. A look that said, "You think you've won." Daniels met that gaze without flinching. Because this wasn't about winning. This was about justice. Walter turned slightly to his lawyer, Alan Winthrop, who had gone disturbingly silent. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Winthrop looked out of his depth. His usually impeccable composure had frayed at the edges, his fingers twitching slightly as he straightened the papers scattered in front of him. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, I must strongly object to this decision," he said, his voice tight. "You have no evidence that my client has committed any crime." Daniels leaned forward, his expression dark. "No evidence." He lifted a manila folder, the one filled with missing children's names, the blackened-out case files, the financial transactions that showed money disappearing right before each child vanished. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "Would you like me to read it out loud, Mr. Winthrop?" Daniels asked. The room fell into absolute silence. Winthrop's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Walter's smirk twitched at the edges. But he said nothing. Instead, he turned to Michaela, the tiny girl sitting motionless in the witness stand, gripping the wooden railing like a life raft in a raging storm. His gaze was cold, piercing, the kind that could shatter a child's sense of safety with just a glance, and it sent a shiver of pure rage through Judge Daniels' spine. Walter tilted his head slightly, his voice coming out smooth, too smooth. "Tell them, Michaela," he said. "Tell them the truth." The words coiled in the air like a snake, slithering toward the frightened girl. Daniels saw it then, the way her tiny hands trembled, the way she curled into herself, as if making herself smaller would somehow make her disappear. The way she had spent 8 years learning how to survive men like Walter Harrington. Daniels' patience snapped. Bang. The gavel struck the bench, the sharp crack of wood on wood cutting through the thick courtroom air. Enough. Walter's eyes flickered with something dangerous, but he stayed silent. Daniels turned his full attention to Michaela. Her wide brown eyes met his, searching, desperate, terrified. But beneath that fear, there was something else. Something she had tried so hard to keep buried. Hope. Daniels leaned forward, his voice softer now, steadier. "You're safe here, Michaela," he said. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Her lower lip trembled. Her tiny fingers clenched around the railing even tighter. She sucked in a sharp breath. And then, in a voice so small, so fragile, yet so powerful, she whispered, "He takes the others away. And they never come back." The room exploded into chaos. Reporters sprang to their feet, cameras flashed, voices rose in disbelief. Michaela's words cut through the courtroom like a knife, slicing straight to the core of something much bigger than this one case. Walter Harrington went very, very still. Judge Daniels felt his blood run cold. Because this wasn't just about abuse. This wasn't just about neglect. This was something far, far worse. A pattern. A trail of missing children. And Michaela was the only one left to tell the story. Daniels looked down at the files again, flipping pages rapidly, searching for something, anything. And then he found it. A name. A single name buried deep within years of paperwork, hidden under layers of red tape. Jordan Matthews. The boy before Michaela. The one who had run away. Except now, that story didn't hold up. Daniel slowly lifted his gaze back to Walter. And he saw it. The moment Walter realized the truth had caught up to him, the tapping of his fingers stopped completely. His body stiffened ever so slightly. His jaw tightened, and Judge Daniels knew. He knew exactly what he was seeing. A man who had spent years hiding a terrible secret. A man who had gotten away with it too many times. But this time, he wouldn't. Daniels stood, his voice steady, unwavering, final. "Mr. Harrington," he said, his next words sealing the fate of the most powerful man in the room. "You are under arrest for the suspected involvement in the disappearance of multiple children. The room exploded. Walter's smirk vanished. The bailiffs moved in. And for the first time since stepping into that courtroom, Michaela Robinson finally breathed. The monster unmasked. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It had transformed into a battlefield, a place where justice was no longer a quiet, methodical process, but a force that had been unleashed like a tidal wave. Walter Harrington, the man who had walked in untouchable, was now trapped. And he knew it. Judge Daniels' voice hung in the air, final and undeniable. "Mr. Harrington, you are under arrest for the suspected involvement in the disappearance of multiple children." Bailiff Johnson took a step forward, his presence a looming shadow over the once powerful businessman. "Stand up," he commanded. Walter didn't immediately comply. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing once, twice, before his hands came to rest flat against the polished wood of the defense table. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he murmured, "This is a mistake." Judge Daniels' expression remained stone cold. "No, Mr. Harrington. The only mistake was assuming no one would ever stop you." For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, Walter's composure faltered. A crack. Barely visible, but Judge Daniels caught it. And that was all he needed. Get him out of here. Johnson moved swiftly, reaching for the cuffs, but Walter finally stood of his own accord. Not in surrender, not in defeat, but in calculation. His face was a carefully constructed mask, but his eyes were alive with something else entirely. Something dark, something dangerous. The gallery held its collective breath. Michaela remained frozen in her seat, her wide eyes locked onto Walter, as if he were some sort of nightmare she had yet to wake from. And then it happened. Walter turned his head, just slightly, just enough so that his gaze landed directly on the tiny girl who had unraveled his empire. The smirk returned. Slow, cold, cruel. Michaela's small fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden railing, her knuckles turning white. Judge Daniels saw it. He felt it. The way the air thickened with silent tension, a tension that came not from words but from something deeper, something unspoken. Walter wasn't just being arrested. He was delivering a message, a promise, a threat. Michaela flinched, her breath catching in her throat. And in that moment, Daniels acted. Bang. The gavel slammed down with thunderous finality, shaking the very walls of the courtroom. Walter's gaze snapped back to him. "This is not your courtroom anymore, Mr. Harrington," Daniels said, his voice hard as steel. "And she is not yours to control." The smirk flickered. A muscle in Walter's jaw twitched. Bailiff Johnson seized the moment, gripping Walter's arms and pulling them behind his back. The metallic clink of the handcuffs rang out, final and irreversible. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, whispers. Reporters scrambled for their phones, their fingers flying over keyboards, their eyes wide with the scent of a breaking scandal. Alan Winthrop, the attorney who had spent his entire career protecting men like Walter Harrington, was now deathly silent. His face was pale, his hands clutching the useless stack of legal papers in front of him. He had lost, and he knew it. The courtroom doors creaked open, and two additional uniformed officers stepped inside, their faces unreadable, their purpose crystal clear. Walter stood still, his shoulders squared, his posture still exuding power, even as he was being dragged away. But as they led him toward the exit, he did something that made Michaela's breath hitch in her throat. He turned his head one last time. His eyes locked onto hers, and in a voice so low it was almost drowned out by the courtroom noise, he murmured, "You think this is over?" Michaela shrank back, her tiny body curling in on itself, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress so tightly it threatened to rip. But before Walter could utter another word, Daniels stood. The move was so sudden, so forceful, that it silenced the entire courtroom instantly. His gaze bore into Walter's, filled with an unspoken warning. And for the first time in Walter's life, He looked uncertain. Judge Daniels took a single step forward, his robe flowing like a shadow of justice itself. Then, in a voice that carried the full weight of the gavel, the law, and decades of experience with men like him, Daniels said, "I hope you get comfortable behind bars, Mr. Harrington, because you're never going to see daylight again." And with that, Walter Harrington was dragged through the doors, his empire of secrets collapsing around him. As the doors slammed shut, the room remained deathly silent. The monster was gone, but the damage he had done was still very much here. The weight of the aftermath. Judge Daniels exhaled, his fingers pressing against his temple. It wasn't over. Not yet. Not when there were missing children still unaccounted for. Not when the entire system had been complicit in hiding the truth. Not when Michaela still sat, trembling, in the witness stand, watching, waiting, unsure if she was truly safe. His gaze softened as he turned back to her. The young girl looked so small, so fragile, as if one wrong move would cause her to disappear entirely. Daniels moved toward her, his voice gentle now, the storm of the trial replaced by something warmer. "It's over, Michaela." She blinked slowly, processing his words, as if she couldn't quite believe them. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "Is it?" The words sliced through him, because the truth was, for Michaela, it wasn't over. Not yet. She had nowhere to go. No family. No home. No certainty that she wouldn't be thrown back into a system that had already failed her once. Judge Daniels inhaled deeply, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like never before. He turned to Bailiff Johnson. "Find every file related to Harrington's placements. We need to locate these children." Johnson nodded, already moving toward the exit. Daniels then turned toward David Fisher, the young prosecutor who had spent the trial teetering on the edge of fear and courage. "You're staying on this case," Daniels said firmly. "We have more work to do." David straightened, determination replacing his nerves. "Yes, Your Honor." Finally, Daniels looked back at Michaela. Her big, tired eyes searched his face for something unspoken. And then Daniels made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "Michaela, you're not going back into the system." The girl stiffened, her breath hitching. Daniels offered the smallest smile, something rare and almost unfamiliar on his usually hardened face. "You're coming with me." Michaela didn't respond at first. Then slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, her small fingers relaxed their grip on her dress. And for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was finally safe. The search for the lost ones. The courtroom had emptied, but the echo of what had happened still lingered in the air. The wooden benches stood vacant, save for a few stray reporters who refused to leave without more information. A janitor moved quietly in the back, sweeping up the dust and chaos left in the wake of Walter Harrington's downfall. Judge Everett Daniels sat at his bench, staring at the stack of files that held secrets buried deep within the cracks of the system. His gavel lay untouched, as if the weight of the past few hours had drained it of its power. Across the room, Michaela Robinson sat stiffly on a bench, her legs swinging slightly but without any real movement. She didn't speak. She barely breathed. She was waiting. Waiting for the moment someone told her this was all a mistake, that she was going back. She didn't trust happy endings. Judge Daniels exhaled, rubbing his fingers against his temple. His work wasn't done. Not even close. Walter Harrington was gone, but his damage remained. And worst of all, the other children were still missing. The first clue. Bailiff Johnson re-entered the room, his footsteps deliberate, his hands gripping a thick file. He had been digging through old case records, searching for anything that could lead them to the children Walter had taken. "Your Honor," Johnson said, placing the file on the bench. His expression was tight. "We found something." Daniels immediately straightened. Michaela, despite herself, tilted her head slightly, listening. Johnson flipped the file open, revealing a faded report dated 3 years ago. The name on the page sent a chill through the room. Jordan Matthews, the boy who had disappeared before Michaela. The case had been officially closed, labeled a runaway, just like so many others. But Daniels could see the inconsistencies. The timeline didn't match up. The reports had been altered, entire paragraphs blackened out. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure Jordan was erased. Daniels' fingers traced the edge of the report, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just negligence. This was a cover-up. Michaela's small voice broke through the silence. Jordan was at the house before me. Daniels and Johnson both turned to her. She sat very still, staring at the paper as if she could still see Jordan's face behind the ink. "What do you remember about him?" Daniels asked, keeping his voice gentle, careful. Michaela hesitated. Her small fingers twisted in her lap, a nervous habit she had developed from years of needing to stay silent. But then she spoke. "He tried to run away." The room froze. Daniel's eyes sharpened. What happened? Michaela's breath hitched, but she forced herself to keep going. "Walter got mad," she whispered. "Real mad." Her tiny hands clenched. He took Jordan down to the basement. Daniels felt his stomach drop. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Michaela said it. The basement. Like it wasn't just a place. Like it was a sentence. Daniels leaned forward. "Did Jordan ever come back upstairs?" Silence. Michaela's lips pressed together, her head shaking once. "No." Daniels inhaled sharply. If Jordan had never come back, where was he now? The warehouse lead. Bailiff Johnson suddenly cleared his throat, flipping through another file. "There's something else here," he said. A financial record. Walter Harrington's company had transactions linked to a warehouse outside the city. Daniels snatched the file, scanning the details. It was a remote property, leased under a different company name, hidden just far enough from prying eyes. Daniel's stomach twisted. "We need to check it out." Johnson nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll get a team together." Daniels turned back to Michaela, who was staring down at her lap, her body curled inward. He crouched in front of her, softening his expression. "Michaela," he said gently, "do you think Jordan might be there?" She didn't answer right away. But when she finally looked up, her eyes were wet with something that wasn't quite hope. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I hope so." The warehouse. A dark discovery. Night had fallen by the time Judge Daniels, Bailiff Johnson, and a team of law enforcement officers arrived at the warehouse. The building stood silent and looming, surrounded by tall chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. The air smelled like damp wood and rust, and the entire place had an eerie stillness, as if it had been abandoned long ago. But it wasn't. The lock on the front gate was new. Someone had been here recently. Daniel's chest tightened. Walter had been careful, but not careful enough. An officer moved forward, cutting the lock with bolt cutters. The heavy doors groaned open, and what they found inside made everyone stop cold. Inside, rows of old metal cages lined the walls. Small cages. Too small. They weren't meant for animals. Daniels felt his hands tighten into fists. His stomach turned. This was where Walter had kept them. The missing children. "Jesus," Johnson muttered under his breath, stepping inside. Dust filled the air, thick and clinging, but Daniels could still see something glinting in the farthest cage. He moved forward, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. It was a bracelet. A child's bracelet. And next to it, a faded notebook. Daniels knelt down, carefully lifting the worn pages. Inside, written in shaky, uneven handwriting, were names. Jordan, Tommy, Sophia, Malik, Eva. The list went on. Some names had check marks next to them. Others had nothing. Daniels swallowed hard. The check marks, they weren't good. Johnson crouched beside him. "You think Jordan's still alive?" Daniels took a deep breath. He wanted to believe it. "We're going to find out." A voice in the dark. Then, from somewhere deep within the warehouse, came a sound. Faint. So quiet it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. Daniels turned sharply, his pulse spiking. Then, there it was again. A muffled sound. A cry. Back there, Johnson shouted, already moving. Daniels followed, his heartbeat hammering. They rushed down a dark hallway, their flashlights cutting through the blackness. The sound grew louder. A soft whimper. A child's voice. Daniels felt his breath catch. Please, God, let it be him. Johnson reached the rusted door first. He gripped the handle and ripped it open. And there, huddled in the darkness, was a boy. Thin, frail, covered in dirt. His wide eyes stared up at them, full of fear, confusion, and recognition. Daniel's chest tightened. Jordan Matthews. The missing boy. The boy who was never supposed to be found. But they had found him. And for the first time in years, he was going home. Justice, retribution, and a new beginning. The warehouse air was thick with dust and silence. Except for one sound. A soft, terrified breath. Jordan Matthews, the boy who had vanished into the cracks of the system, stared up at them from his dark corner, his body curled inward, as if expecting another blow. He didn't move. Didn't trust the light flooding the room. Didn't trust the hands reaching for him. Because the last time someone had reached for him, it had led to nightmares. Judge Everett Daniels knelt, lowering himself to Jordan's level. He wasn't a police officer. He wasn't a social worker. He wasn't part of the system that had abandoned him. He was just a man who had made a promise. To Michaela. To Jordan. To all of them. We're here to take you home, Daniel said, his voice steady but gentle. Jordan didn't speak, didn't move. His wide, fearful eyes flicked between the officers, the open door, the unfamiliar faces. He had spent so long being forgotten, being erased, that now even freedom felt like a trap. Daniels reached out slowly, not touching, just offering. A moment passed. Then another. Then, Jordan's thin fingers twitched. And for the first time in 3 years, he reached back. Back at the courthouse. The aftermath of evil. The next morning, Weston County Courthouse was flooded with chaos. Reporters, news crews, and city officials swarmed the front steps, demanding answers, demanding justice. The arrest of Walter Harrington had sent shockwaves through the legal system. A wealthy businessman, a man who had been seen donating to charities, attending city galas, shaking hands with politicians, was now being accused of child trafficking, abuse, and conspiracy. And worse, the more investigators dug into his records, the more they realized how deep the corruption went. Dozens of judges, attorneys, and caseworkers had been paid off. Entire child welfare reports had been erased. Countless children had disappeared, marked as runaways, their cases quietly closed without investigation. And now, it was all unraveling. Judge Daniels stood in his private chambers, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The trial ahead wouldn't be easy. Walter Harrington wasn't just a criminal. He was a man with deep connections, powerful allies, and people who were willing to cover up his sins. The real fight was just beginning. Michaela and Jordan. The road to healing. Inside a quiet office, Michaela sat on the couch, her fingers tracing the seams of her dress. Across from her, Jordan sat stiffly in his chair, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds, as if still waiting for someone to come back for him. They hadn't spoken since he arrived, hadn't acknowledged the shared pain between them. Because some wounds didn't have words. They only had silence. Then, finally, Michaela spoke. "You were in the basement." Jordan flinched, his hands clenched into small fists. He nodded once, a movement so small and fragile, it looked like it might break him. Michaela's breath shuddered. She knew what that basement was. She knew what Walter did in the dark. And now, she knew that Jordan had lived it too. Her fingers hesitated before she reached out. Just barely, just enough to offer. A moment passed, then another. And then Jordan reached back. Not much, but enough. Enough to say, we survived. Enough to say, we're not alone. Enough to say, we're still here. The final blow. The trial of Walter Harrington. The trial was the biggest in city history. Every news station covered it. Every legal analyst had an opinion. The prosecution presented the evidence in waves. The financial records, the missing child reports, the social workers who had been paid to keep quiet. And then, they'd brought in Michaela and Jordan, the only two survivors. The courtroom fell into dead silence as Michaela took the stand. She didn't flinch, didn't hide, didn't shrink into herself like she once had. She sat tall, her chin lifted, her small hands resting calmly in her lap. And when she spoke, she shattered the world. She told them everything. She told them about the basement, about the nights without food, about the locked doors, about the other children, the ones who never came back. Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade, because they weren't just words. They were a reckoning. Walter Harrington sat across from her, his suit crisp, his face impassive, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. But Michaela never looked away from him. And in that moment, Walter knew. He had lost. It took the jury less than 2 hours to return the verdict. Guilty. On all charges. The gallery erupted into whispers as Walter Harrington, the man who had once walked freely among the rich and powerful, was sentenced to multiple life terms. When they took him away, he didn't smirk. He didn't smile. He didn't even look back. Because there was nothing left for him to control. His world was over. And Michaela, for the first time in her life, she had won. A new beginning. 1 month later, Judge Daniels walked up the worn porch steps of an old house, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. He knocked once, twice, and then the door swung open. Michaela beamed up at him. Her braids were neat, her dress was bright, and her eyes no longer carried the weight of fear. Behind her, Jordan peeked around the doorway, still quiet, but standing stronger than before. And then, from inside, a warm voice called out, "Judge Daniels, is that you?" Loretta Robinson, Michaela's long-lost grandmother, stepped into view, a smile creasing her weathered face. Daniels took in the sight of the home she had built for them. The warm smells from the kitchen, the blankets folded neatly on the couch, the family photos now lining the walls. It was a place of safety, a place of healing, a place where Michaela and Jordan could finally be children again. Daniels knelt down, meeting Michaela's bright, fearless eyes. "Are you happy?" Michaela nodded, her voice steady and sure. "I am now." Judge Daniels smiled. Justice had been served. But more than that, 2 children had finally come home. And that was the real victory.